1906, the surgeon who performed a lobotomy to stop the voices, but they did not come from him. Under the flickering light of a gas lamp, a man stood in silence, his gloved hands trembling above a tray of surgical instruments. The year was 1906, and inside a dimly lit hospital in northern England, whispers spoke of a surgeon who had crossed the invisible line between medicine and madness. They said he was a genius, a man who could silence voices that haunted the minds of the broken. But no one dared to ask whose voices he was truly trying to silence. Tonight, you will hear what history refused to record. You will see what his students were forced to forget. And if you stay until the end, you can learn the hidden detail from his final experiment, a truth so disturbing that it was sealed for over a century. The story begins with Dr. Alaric Hensley, a respected neurologist with a reputation that shimmered between brilliance and obsession. His colleagues admired his steady hands, his precision, and his uncanny ability to remain calm, even as others panicked at the sight of blood. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet, relentless desperation, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Hensley's patients were the lost souls of the asylum, men and women who claimed to hear voices that guided, taunted, and condemned them. He believed he could cure them, not through prayer or confinement, but through the blade. He called it the liberation of the mind. And for a time, it seemed to work. His first patients awoke in eerie stillness, their screams replaced by a haunting calm. The newspapers called him a miracle worker. But behind closed doors, the silence that followed his surgeries was not peace. It was emptiness. One nurse would later confess that sometimes, after the procedures, she would hear faint whispers echoing down the hall, though every patient in the ward was sedated. Others said they saw Hensley wandering the corridors at night, mumbling to himself as if answering a voice that only he could hear. By the spring of that year, his obsession had consumed him. He stopped attending church, stopped writing letters, stopped eating with his colleagues. He spent his nights in the surgical theatre, surrounded by jars of preserved brains and cryptic notes written in a language no one could decipher. And then one morning, his assistant found something that made the blood drain from his face, a note left on the operating table. It read, "The voices have found their way inside. The next operation must be mine." What happened after that note was never included in the official records, but there exists a single page, torn from his personal journal, discovered decades later in the walls of the abandoned hospital. And what it revealed changed everything we thought we knew about the origins of modern psychosurgery. Stay with me until the end, because once you hear what was done in that room, you'll understand why some secrets are buried deeper than the dead themselves. The year was 1906, an age of invention, ambition, and fear disguised as progress. The world was changing faster than the human mind could comprehend. Cities burned brighter with electricity, machines roared in the streets, and men believed science could finally conquer the mysteries of the soul. But in the quiet corners of Europe, where fog clung to the old hospitals and asylums like ghosts that refused to leave, medicine had become something else entirely, a battlefield between reason and madness. In northern England, the small industrial town of Waincroft was known for its coal mines and its silence. Every house seemed covered in a thin layer of soot, and the air itself smelled of metal and sorrow. It was here, at the edge of town, that St. Elora's Asylum stood, a towering relic of Victorian design, its iron gates sealed with rust and its windows clouded by decades of condensation. Few ever entered willingly, and even fewer left unchanged. Inside those walls, the cries of the forgotten echoed through long, cold hallways. They said the building itself breathed, expanding and contracting with the wind, whispering through pipes and vents that led nowhere. Nurses swore they heard their own names called from empty rooms. Patients muttered of shadows that moved independently of the light. And through it all, Dr. Alaric Hensley walked with quiet precision, his white coat gleaming under flickering bulbs, as though untouched by the decay that surrounded him. Hensley was part of a new generation of physicians, men who sought to peel away the layers of human suffering through scalpels rather than prayers. The early 20th century was obsessed with the human brain. Scientists believed they were on the verge of unlocking the mechanics of consciousness itself. It was the golden age of neurology, and also its darkest. While the rest of England was swept by the promises of modernization, St. Elora's Asylum operated in a fog of secrecy. The government sent its unfit citizens there, the deaf, the epileptic, the hysterical, the poor. Many were never diagnosed, merely discarded. For officials, the asylum was convenient. For Hensley, it was a laboratory. Each patient represented another chance to silence the inner storms that had destroyed his reputation in London. At night, the town of Waincroft would see strange lights flickering behind the asylum's windows, a cold, surgical glow that pulsed long after midnight. Some said he worked tirelessly to cure madness, others whispered he was trying to cure himself. The locals avoided the area after sunset. Children were warned never to wander too close. Coal workers crossing the nearby fields swore they could hear distant humming, like a prayer being whispered through walls. And then there were the disappearances. A few patients listed as transferred, yet no record of where they went. What few records remain describe the asylum as a place of experimental neurosurgical intervention. But the reports are inconsistent. Some describe small incisions behind the eyes, early prototypes of the procedure that would later be known as the lobotomy. Others mention strange circular scars on the skull, too precise to be random, too crude to be humane. And somewhere in those contradictions lies the truth. Dr. Hensley was not merely treating voices, he was chasing them. He claimed that through careful surgery, he could locate the source of auditory hallucinations, the seat of torment within the brain. But no one questioned how he came to that theory. Some say he based it on the ravings of a dying patient. Others insist he heard the same voices himself. What we know is this: by 1906, St. Elora's was no longer just a hospital. It was a cathedral of silence, a monument to one man's obsession with conquering what he could not understand. And beneath its floors, among the preserved organs and surgical notes, the truth waited, untouched, unseen, and unspeakable. It is there, in that suffocating mix of progress and despair, that our story takes root. A surgeon at war with unseen voices, a town haunted by what was done in the name of science, and a century-old mystery that refused to die, because what was buried in those walls was never truly dead. Dr. Alaric Hensley was not born a monster, he was born into silence. The son of a rural pastor and a mother who died during childbirth, he grew up in a small parsonage on the outskirts of York. His father, a strict and distant man, preached about salvation through suffering. Pain, he often told his congregation, is the only proof that God still speaks. Alaric listened. He listened so well that by the age of 12, he claimed he could hear the murmurs of angels when he closed his eyes. His father called it a gift. The local doctor called it exhaustion. Years later, Hensley would call it the beginning. Those who knew him in his youth described a quiet, brilliant boy who dissected frogs under candlelight and spoke more to books than to people. At university, he became known for his intellect and precision, but also for his lack of empathy. His professors admired his steady hands and his hunger for understanding the mind's architecture, yet there was something unnerving in the way he studied the human brain, not with reverence, but with ownership. "If the mind is a maze," he once told a classmate, "then I was born to find its center." When he arrived at St. Elora's Asylum, he was accompanied by two figures who would become essential to his story: Nurse Evelyn Ray and assistant Samuel Pike. Evelyn, a young widow who had lost her husband to the Boer War, joined the asylum to escape her grief. She believed that by caring for the broken, she might heal herself. Her kindness was the only warmth within those cold, sterile halls. She often stayed late, reading to patients who could no longer speak, unaware that her presence alone kept Hensley tethered to what remained of his humanity. Samuel Pike, on the other hand, was a man of curiosity rather than compassion. A self-taught engineer fascinated by anatomy, he saw in Hensley the reflection of his own ambition, someone willing to cross boundaries others feared. It was Pike who helped design the crude surgical tools that made Hensley's experiments possible. He called them keys to the mind. The three formed a strange trinity within the asylum: the doctor who believed he could silence suffering, the nurse who tried to comfort it, and the assistant who wanted to mechanize it. For months they worked together in uneasy harmony, each feeding the other's need for redemption, for purpose, for power. Then came patient 23. A young woman, barely 20, brought in from a nearby convent after she began screaming during Mass that the dead were speaking through the walls. Her name was Clara Weston. Her file described her as hysterical and devout. But when Evelyn met her, she saw something else: terror mixed with a heartbreaking clarity. Clara didn't ramble like the others. She spoke in short, trembling phrases, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as if listening to something above them. "She doesn't need surgery," Evelyn had pleaded one night. "She needs rest, she needs faith." But Hensley disagreed. To him, Clara was proof. If he could trace the voices within her, if he could isolate the source, he would finally silence his own. From that moment, their paths were set. Evelyn's compassion would collide with Hensley's obsession, and Samuel's inventions would make both possible. What none of them understood was that the voices Clara heard, the ones she begged them to ignore, were not trying to torment her. They were trying to warn her. And when the first incision was made, it would not be just a wound on her flesh, but a crack in the boundary between science and something far older, something that watched and waited inside the silence. The night before Clara's surgery, a storm rolled over Wayncroft with a violence the town hadn't seen in years. Thunder rattled the window panes of St. Elora's, and the power flickered until only the oil lamps remained. Nurse Evelyn Ray walked the empty corridor, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by the hum of the wind. She paused outside the surgical theatre and saw something strange. Dr. Hensley inside, alone, arranging instruments with unnatural care. He didn't seem to notice the storm at all. On the table beside him lay Clara's medical file, open and marked with red ink. Several words had been circled repeatedly: auditory hallucinations, source unclear. But what caught Evelyn's eye wasn't the ink. It was the smell, not of alcohol or iodine, but of something metallic and old, like rusted pipes or blood that had dried long ago. When Hensley stepped away, she saw what he had been working on: a small brass object no larger than a pocket watch, engraved with strange geometric lines. Inside its glass cover was a thin coil that pulsed faintly with light. It looked less like a medical tool and more like a relic, something ancient that didn't belong among scalpels and gauze. Before she could speak, Hensley turned sharply. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice too calm for the hour. "This instrument must remain unseen until it fulfills its purpose." He covered it with a cloth, but not before she caught a glimpse of a faint inscription on the brass: Vox Silenti, the voice of silence. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The storm seemed to move through the halls, whispering between the doors. When she finally drifted into uneasy rest, a sound pulled her awake: the distant ringing of a bell. It came from the old chapel wing, which had been closed for years. Against her better judgment, she took her lantern and followed the sound. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. The hall smelled of dust and candle wax. Faded murals of angels peeled from the walls, their faces eroded by moisture. At the end of the corridor stood a locked wooden door she had never seen before. Beneath it, a thin stream of light flickered, as if someone were moving inside. She hesitated, heart pounding, and pressed her ear against the wood. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, trembling. "He hears them too." Evelyn stumbled back, the lantern nearly falling from her hand. When she blinked, the light beneath the door vanished. The corridor was empty again. The next morning she told Hensley what she'd heard. He dismissed it with an almost forced smile. "The mind projects what it fears, Miss Ray. You've been here too long." But as he spoke, his hand trembled ever so slightly, and Evelyn noticed that his fingernails were stained with something dark, not blood, but soot. Later that day, Samuel Pike brought new notes to the lab, sketches of a brain with markings that didn't match any anatomy textbook. In the corner of the page, someone had written a phrase in Latin, "Non veniunt habilis." They do not come from them. Evelyn felt a chill crawl down her spine. It was the same phrase Clara had muttered in her sleep 2 nights before. She didn't yet know it, but that locked chapel door, the strange device, and those whispered words were not coincidences. They were the first signs that the voices tormenting Clara, and perhaps Dr. Hensley himself, were not born from within the mind at all. They were calling from somewhere else. By dawn, the asylum had settled into a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the fields slick with mud and the air heavy with the smell of ozone. Inside St. Elora's, the day began like any other. The clang of metal basins, the shuffle of weary nurses, the low moans of patients waking from medicated dreams. But beneath that routine, something unseen had shifted. Evelyn felt it in the walls, in the silence between footsteps, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Dr. Hensley announced that Clara's operation would take place that evening. His tone was clinical, rehearsed, but there was a feverish gleam in his eyes. He told the staff it would be a controlled exploration of the auditory cortex, but to Evelyn, it sounded more like a confession or a warning. Clara was led to her room for preparation, trembling yet eerily calm, whispering, "It's not me he wants, it's them." Evelyn tried to intervene. She went to the hospital board, pleading for a postponement, arguing that the girl's mind was fragile, her body weak. But the board members barely listened. To them, Clara was just another number in a long list of incurable cases. The asylum's funding depended on results, and Hensley's name still carried weight in medical circles. "If the procedure succeeds," one official muttered, "it will place St. Elora's at the forefront of neurological innovation." In that moment, Evelyn understood. The asylum was not a place of healing. It was a stage, and Clara was the sacrifice. When she returned to the ward, Samuel Pike was calibrating the brass instrument. Sparks danced along its coil, emitting a faint hum that seemed almost alive. Evelyn demanded to know what it did. Pike hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "It amplifies electrical currents, but Hensley says it can also separate frequencies, human from inhuman." He glanced toward the door. "I didn't build it for this. He's using it for something else." The injustice of it all burned through Evelyn like fire. A young woman condemned for hearing what no one else could, a doctor worshipped for silencing those who cried for help, and a system that mistook cruelty for progress. She thought of the other patients, the hollow-eyed veterans, the women labeled hysterical for grieving too long, the children abandoned for being difficult. Every one of them entrusted their minds to men who believed they could carve salvation with a scalpel. As dusk approached, the asylum grew unnervingly quiet. The nurses whispered prayers under their breath. The patients, even the violent ones, seemed subdued, as if sensing something monumental was about to happen. Evelyn watched as Hensley entered the operating room, his posture stiff, his face pale beneath the gaslight. Clara lay upon the table, eyes wide open, murmuring a single phrase again and again. He thinks he's cutting them out, but they are already inside. When Evelyn tried to approach, Hensley stopped her at the door. "You will stand back," he said coldly. "This is not cruelty, it's liberation." "Liberation?" she hissed. "From what? Her humanity?" He looked at her then, and for the briefest moment, his mask of control faltered. "From the noise," he whispered. "You wouldn't understand." The door closed between them with a hollow thud. The instruments clinked. The hum of the brass device filled the corridor like a low chant. And as the clock struck 7, Evelyn swore she heard another sound, a faint overlapping chorus of voices rising from deep within the asylum's foundations. They were not screams of pain. They were calling his name. In that moment, the lines between healer and sinner, sanity and obsession, blurred completely. What began as a scientific pursuit had become something else entirely, a ritual of silence carried out under the guise of medicine, and Clara Weston was its unwilling offering. The operation began under the pale hum of gas lamps, their light trembling across the tiled walls like restless ghosts. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows, carrying the faint echo of church bells from the distant town. Inside the theater, time seemed suspended. Dr. Hensley stood over Clara's body, his eyes hollow, his gloved hands steady as he adjusted the strange brass instrument, Vox Silenti, now connected by wires to the patient's temple. Samuel Pike monitored the dials, his face tense, while Nurse Evelyn watched from the observation room, her breath fogging the glass. The first incision was made. Hensley's movements were mechanical, precise, almost reverent. Clara did not scream. The anesthesia had taken hold, yet her lips moved faintly, whispering words that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "They're behind him." A sharp crack filled the air as one of the bulbs burst above the table, plunging half the room into shadow. Pike reached to replace it, but Hensley didn't even flinch. He simply murmured, "Increase the current." The device pulsed, its coil glowing brighter. A low hum began to build, not from the machine, but from the walls themselves, a resonant vibration that made the instruments rattle on the tray. Evelyn pressed her ear against the observation glass. Beneath the hum, she heard something impossible. Faint voices layered within the sound, speaking in fragments. At first, she thought it was an auditory illusion, but then one voice rose above the rest, distinct and desperate. It was Clara's, though her mouth remained still. Pike froze. "Doctor," he stammered, "she's speaking, but not from her." "Silence!" Hensley barked. Sweat dripped down his brow as he leaned closer to the wound, his pupils dilated. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "The frequency. It's external. They've been transmitting through us all along." The hum grew into a shuddering drone that shook the lamps. The brass instrument emitted a flash of blue light. Clara's body convulsed violently, and Evelyn screamed for them to stop, slamming her fists against the glass. But Hensley continued, lost in a trance. "I can isolate them," he muttered. "I can see where they hide." Then came the sound that silenced everyone, a deep, guttural moan, not human, echoing from the metal vents above. The temperature dropped so fast that Evelyn's breath turned to mist. The instruments trembled on the trays as the air seemed to compress. Clara's eyes snapped open. The pupils were gone, only white. And from her throat came a sound that no one in that room would ever forget. A dozen voices speaking as one, layered over each other, whispering in a language older than words. Pike stumbled backward, horrified. The lights flickered violently. The coil in the brass device began to spin faster and faster until it whined like a swarm of insects. Then, without warning, the machine burst apart, shards of metal scattering across the room. Hensley fell back, clutching his head, screaming, "Get them out! Get them out!" The power cut out completely. Only the rain outside illuminated the chaos in brief flashes. Evelyn rushed in, slipping on the wet floor, and found Clara's body still. Hensley was kneeling beside her, his hands trembling, his face streaked with blood from a shallow cut across his temple. But what stopped Evelyn cold was not the blood. It was the expression on his face. He wasn't looking at Clara. He was looking past her, into the dark corner of the room, whispering to something unseen. "They're free now," he said softly. "They've found me." When the lights finally returned, Clara was gone. The table was empty, the straps unfastened. Only a faint smear of blood trailed toward the chapel corridor. Evelyn looked around in disbelief, but Hensley was silent, staring at the brass fragments scattered on the floor. One piece, no larger than a coin, still glowed faintly, etched with a new inscription that hadn't been there before. It read, "Non venient ab illis." They do not come from them, and for the first time, Evelyn understood. The voices had never belonged to the patients. They were simply the doors through which something else had been listening, waiting, and now it had crossed over. The corridors of St. Elora's had never been so silent. The storm had died, but its absence only made the building feel more alive, as if the wind itself had taken refuge inside the walls. Evelyn staggered out of the surgical theatre, her shoes slipping on the wet floor. The lamps flickered weakly, revealing streaks of blood that led away from the operating table and vanished near the chapel wing. Clara Weston was gone. No trace of her body, no sound of her voice. Samuel Pike rushed through the hall carrying a lantern, his hands trembling. "She couldn't have moved," he whispered. "Not after what we saw, not after that." But Hensley stood motionless, staring at the shattered remains of his machine. His voice, when it came, was almost childlike. "She's awake," he murmured. "Not lost, awakened." He turned to Evelyn, eyes glistening. "Don't you see? We didn't remove the voices, we released them." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Released them? From where?" He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up one of the glowing fragments of brass and pressed it against his palm, as if expecting it to burn. "They were never inside her mind," he said. "They were waiting beyond it. The brain was only their door." That night, the asylum descended into chaos. Patients began screaming in unison, their cries merging into a terrible rhythmic chant. One by one, the light bulbs shattered, plunging the wards into darkness. From the upper floors came the sound of pounding, fists or something else, against the locked iron doors. Evelyn and Pike barricaded themselves in the records room. Papers fluttered across the floor, the wind carrying whispers between them. Pike tore through the archives, desperate to understand what was happening. Then he found something strange. A hidden folder sealed inside an old ledger. It contained drawings of the Vox Silentiae, dated years before Hensley's time at St. Elora's. At the bottom of the page, written in the same spidery hand that had marked the Latin inscriptions, was the name of another doctor. Dr. Merrin Hensley, Alaric's father. Evelyn froze. "He didn't invent it," she whispered. "He inherited it." Suddenly, the whispers around them rose into a low, thrumming vibration. The air thickened, smelling of copper and smoke. Pike's lantern flickered, revealing words scrawled across the wall, faint, as if written by invisible fingers. "We never left." Before they could react, the iron door behind them groaned and swung open on its own. The hallway beyond was dark, but at the far end, under the flicker of a single gaslight, stood Clara. Her hospital gown was torn, her feet bare, her eyes open, pale and luminous. She didn't move, didn't speak, but when Evelyn took a step forward, the lamps around them dimmed, and the whispers returned, hundreds of them, now speaking through Clara's unmoving mouth. "You cut the flesh," they said in perfect unison, "but the door remains open." Then the light went out. When it returned, Clara was gone again, leaving only the faint smell of ozone and the single word carved into the stone floor beneath her footprints. Below. Evelyn turned to Hensley, who had appeared silently in the doorway, his face ghost-white. "She's leading us," he said softly. "They're not finished yet." And with that, he began walking toward the old cellar stairs, the ones sealed since the Asylum S construction, whispering, "My father built this place for them." It was no longer just a story of madness or medicine. It was a legacy, and the true experiment, Evelyn realized, was never about silencing voices. It was about inviting them through. The descent into the cellar felt like entering another century. The air grew damp, carrying the scent of mold and rust, and the light from their lantern trembled against the stone walls, revealing markings that hadn't been seen in decades. Evelyn followed closely behind Hensley, her heart pounding. Samuel Pike trailed with the second lantern, muttering prayers under his breath. The stairway spiraled downward farther than any building blueprint had ever shown. It was as if the asylum itself extended beneath the earth, a hidden world that had waited all along. When they finally reached the bottom, they found a narrow corridor lined with sealed doors. The stone was etched with the same strange symbols carved on the Vox Silenti. Each mark seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to their presence. Hensley moved ahead, his fingers brushing along the walls as if tracing a memory. "My father worked here," he whispered. "Before St. Elora's became a hospital, this was his laboratory." Evelyn stopped cold. "You knew this was here?" He shook his head slowly. "Not until I heard them." At the end of the corridor, they reached a heavy iron door bolted from the outside. A faded plaque above it read in Latin, "Custodi voces." Guard the voices. The bolts were ancient, but someone had recently tried to pry them open. Fresh scratches gleamed on the metal. Pike hesitated. "Whatever's inside," he said. "Someone wanted it to stay locked." Hensley didn't respond. He lifted a crowbar from the floor and forced the door open with a violent crack. A wave of cold air rushed past them, extinguishing the lantern for a moment. When the flame returned, it revealed a massive underground chamber filled with dust-covered tables, glass jars, and rusted surgical instruments. But among the debris stood something far more disturbing. A circle of iron chairs, each equipped with crude restraints and electrical nodes fixed to the headrests. In the center of the circle was an enormous copper apparatus, half buried under sheets and cobwebs. It was identical in design to the Vox Silenti, only larger, as if it had been built to capture not one mind, but many. Pike's face went pale. "This isn't medicine," he whispered. It's a transmitter." Evelyn approached a nearby table covered in files. The papers were brittle, but the handwriting unmistakable. Dr. Merrin Hensley. Notes dated 1873 described collective resonance experiments conducted on unwilling subjects from local workhouses. He had believed the voices of the insane were not delusions but echoes, remnants of consciousness trapped between worlds. His goal was to find a way to communicate with them, to harness the energy of the departed mind. Hensley's hands trembled as he read his father's words. "He wasn't curing madness," he murmured. "He was summoning it." Evelyn flipped through more records. The names listed as subjects, men, women, even children, matched those recorded as patients who had died of complications at St. Elora's earliest years. But their autopsy notes were missing. Every single one. A sudden noise interrupted them, a metallic clang echoing from deeper in the chamber. Pike swung his lantern toward the sound. In the far corner, beneath a tarp, something shifted. Evelyn's breath caught as the cloth fell away, revealing another iron chair. But this one was occupied. A skeleton sat upright, bound by the restraints, its skull pierced by a cluster of wires that still hummed faintly with current. And clutched between its skeletal fingers was a journal identical to the one Hensley kept in his study. He reached out slowly and pried it free. The cover bore a single word, burned into the leather: Alaric. The pages inside were newer, written in his own handwriting, yet he had never written them. The ink was still fresh. Evelyn stared in horror as Hensley flipped through entries that detailed events of the past days with impossible precision, every word spoken, every scream heard. The last line was dated that very night. It read, "They will descend, they will see, and then they will remember." Suddenly the humming in the wires grew louder, the lights flickered. The copper device in the center began to glow, the air vibrating like a living thing. From the walls came a faint chorus of whispers, not pleading this time, but welcoming. Pike shouted, "It's turning on!" Evelyn grabbed Hensley's arm. "We have to leave, and now!" But Hensley didn't move. His gaze was locked on the glowing machine. "He built it to speak to them," he said, his voice trembling with awe. "But they don't want to speak anymore." The whispers rose into a deafening chorus, overlapping, almost human, and yet older, deeper, as if the very stones of the asylum were remembering what they had once contained. Evelyn pulled Hensley toward the stairs, shouting his name, but he didn't respond. His eyes had gone distant, his lips moving silently in rhythm with the voices that surrounded them. And as the chamber filled with the sound of awakening, one phrase echoed above all the others, reverberating through the darkness. "The door is open once more." The stairwell trembled beneath their feet as Evelyn, Hensley, and Pike ascended from the hidden chamber. But the echoes of the voices followed them, clinging to the walls like shadows that refused to leave. Each step seemed to draw the whispers closer, murmuring fragments of ancient language, phrases that were not quite English, yet somehow intelligible. They came through. "The veil is thin. We were waiting." Evelyn's heart pounded so fiercely it seemed to sink with the rhythmic chant emanating from beneath the asylum. When they emerged into the main hall, the scene was unlike anything Evelyn had ever witnessed. Patients were no longer confined to their wards. They moved as if guided by an unseen force. Some wandered aimlessly, eyes vacant. Others spoke in unison, reciting lines of text that seemed to flow from some collective consciousness. The nurses and staff had barricaded themselves in offices, shouting warnings, but their words were drowned by the chorus of voices swelling throughout the asylum. Hensley stopped in the center of the hall, pale and trembling. "Do you see it now?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. "The voices, they've never belonged to the patients. They were never inside the human mind at all. They were waiting in the walls, in the foundations, in the instruments, waiting for someone to open the door." Evelyn's mind reeled. The brass device, the copper apparatus, all of it was a key. He nodded. "Yes. My father discovered them, and I thought I was conquering madness. But all I did was invite it through." His hands shook violently. "And now, it has remembered." At that moment, the whispers condensed into a single intelligible voice, speaking in a tone that seemed to resonate both inside their ears and within their very bones. The surgeon believed he could silence, but he cannot silence what is eternal. The mind is a door, the body is a vessel, and now the vessel is empty, the door open. The crowd of patients stopped in perfect unison, staring toward the far end of the hall, where the chapel doors creaked open by themselves. From the darkness emerged Clara Weston, No longer the fragile girl they had known, but something different, something neither fully human nor fully spirit. Her eyes glowed with an inner light, and her lips moved as the chorus of voices spoke through her. She raised her hands, and the entire hall seemed to pulse in response. Evelyn could barely stand, gripping Hensley's arm. She's channeling them," she whispered. "The voices. They're using her as a conduit." Hensley's face was a mask of horror and fascination. "It was never about curing anyone," he said. "It was about understanding them. But understanding is impossible. They cannot be contained. They cannot be silenced." He stumbled backward, nearly collapsing as the voices intensified, filling the hall with a resonance that made the stone floor vibrate beneath their feet. Then came the revelation that shattered every remaining illusion. The walls of St. Elora's, the instruments, even the asylum itself, all had been constructed with meticulous intention. Hidden chambers, sealed stairwells, and reinforced floors weren't designed to protect patients from harm. They were designed to contain the echoes of consciousness, remnants of all those who had been experimented upon, whose minds had been dissected, analyzed, and left behind. The voices that Hensley thought he could manipulate were the memories of generations trapped within the building, waiting for a mind capable of unlocking the barrier. Evelyn's stomach turned as she understood the magnitude of the injustice. These were not merely voices of the mentally ill. They were fragments of human suffering, stolen by ambition and obsession, preserved in silence and now released. Hensley had not healed. He had violated not one life, but countless lives across decades, generations even, under the guise of progress. The crescendo of whispers shifted, coalescing into a singular revelation. The surgeon cannot hide. The surgeon must listen. Hensley clutched his head, screaming as the voices pierced his mind, repeating memories he had never lived, sensations he could not have imagined. The asylum itself seemed to respond, doors slamming open and closing with deafening force, echoing the torment of every soul trapped within. Clara's form began to dissipate, her body dissolving into the hum of the voices, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than anything Evelyn had ever known. And then, as abruptly as it began, the noise ceased. The patient slumped to the floor, exhausted but alive. The staff cautiously emerged from their offices, their faces pale, trembling from the ordeal. Hensley remained on his knees in the center of the hall, tears streaking his face. He looked at Evelyn with a mixture of shame and awe. "They never came from me," he whispered, "and they never belonged to me. They belong to all of us, and to all who suffered before us. I thought I was a master of the mind, but I was only a student. And the lesson is far older than I imagined." Evelyn helped him to his feet, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down like a physical force. She understood now that the true horror of St. Elora's was not Hensley's obsession alone, but the centuries of secrecy, exploitation, and cruelty that had allowed such power to accumulate unchecked. As they exited the hall, a single phrase etched itself into her memory, whispered one last time by the air itself. "The doors are open, and the voices will not forget." And in that moment, Evelyn realized the grim truth. History itself had been waiting for someone to listen, and now the voices, the echoes of suffering, injustice, and humanity long silenced, had been heard. The events at St. Elora's did not end with the dawn. The asylum remained standing, its walls scarred and hollowed by the echoes of what had transpired, but the weight of those voices lingered far beyond its stone halls. Evelyn walked through the empty wards, the quiet punctuated only by the soft drip of water from cracked pipes. Each room bore silent testimony to the lives that had been dissected, studied, and silenced. and to the profound injustice that had allowed such experiments to continue for decades. It was impossible to leave without carrying a sense of guilt and sorrow. Every patient, every name etched in the records, represented more than a medical case. They were fragments of humanity, each story a cautionary tale of how ambition can become cruelty when unchecked by conscience. Evelyn understood now that the true horror of Hensley-S actions was not just in the surgical procedures, but in the systemic neglect that allowed them to flourish. Institutions meant to heal had become instruments of oppression, and the boundaries between science, morality, and abuse had been erased in the pursuit of progress. The town of Wayncroft would never speak openly of that night. For years, rumors circulated of strange lights in the windows, of faint whispers carried on the wind, and of those who had wandered too close, only to return changed, haunted by something unseen. But the history books remained silent. Official records described Hensley as a pioneering neurologist, a man ahead of his time, while the victims' voices, those who had suffered, resisted, and ultimately been forgotten, were relegated to obscurity. For Evelyn, the emotional impact was profound. She realized that science, when divorced from empathy, can become a weapon more devastating than any blade. The echoes of Clara, the other patients, and even the long-dead subjects of Dr. Merrin Hensley-S experiments reminded her that the pursuit of knowledge carries a responsibility, one that extends beyond ambition, beyond fame, beyond personal obsession. Every mind, every life is a world unto itself, deserving of respect, care, and recognition. Yet amid the sorrow, there was a glimmer of understanding. The voices, though terrifying, though tragic, had survived. They had endured the cruelty of generations and persisted, demanding to be heard. In that persistence lay a lesson. History is not only written by those in power, but also by those who suffer in silence. Their stories may be buried, their names may fade, but the echoes remain, waiting for someone brave enough to acknowledge them. Evelyn often reflected on what it meant to bear witness. She understood that the story of St. Elora's was not just about a single surgeon's hubris, or a young patient's ordeal, or even the technological marvels of early neurology. It was about the moral choices societies make, the lives they prioritize, the suffering they tolerate, and the histories they choose to record or erase. Standing once more in the asylum's central hall, now empty and still, Evelyn whispered a promise to those who had been silenced. She vowed that their experiences, their pain, and their resilience would not be forgotten. That promise became a bridge between past and present, a call to recognize the shadows hidden behind progress, and a reminder that humanity's most haunting lessons are often those we least wish to confront. The story of St. Elora S. and the surgeon of 1906 serves as a chilling reflection. The pursuit of knowledge without conscience can open doors that should never have existed, and the voices of the forgotten, though quieted, will inevitably demand to be heard. And when they are, the world is forced to reckon with the depth of its own darkness. If you've followed this story to its chilling conclusion, then you've witnessed a glimpse of history that most were never meant to see. The events at St. Elora S. are more than a tale of obsession and cruelty. They are a reminder that the shadows of the past continue to whisper, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Now it's your turn to reflect and share your thoughts. What do you think drove Dr. Hensley to cross the line between genius and madness? Was it curiosity, desperation, or something far darker? And what about the victims, the countless lives trapped in silence and secrecy? Could such tragedies happen again under the guise of progress? Type your thoughts below. We want to hear your perspective. Every comment helps uncover the hidden layers of history that official records often ignore. If this story fascinated you, there are countless more hidden tales of injustice, dark experiments, and mysteries of the past waiting to be revealed. By subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications, you'll gain access to stories that challenge what you think you know about history. Stories that reveal the forgotten, the sinister, and the shocking. For those who stayed until the end, the final twist of this story, the realization that the voices never truly belonged to the patients, is just the beginning. Imagine what else lies buried, waiting in the shadows of history, and how many untold stories still demand to be heard. So don't hesitate. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join a community dedicated to exploring the darkest corners of our past. Share your theories, your reactions, and your questions in the comments. Your engagement not only helps uncover more mysteries, it keeps the memory of those forgotten voices alive. Remember, history is not just about dates and events. It's about the lives behind them, the silences in between, and the truths we dare to confront. Comment below, subscribe, and be part of the journey into the hidden, the forbidden, and the truly haunting stories of our world. As the echoes of St. Elora's fade into silence, one cannot help but feel the weight of what has been uncovered. The asylum stands still now, its halls empty but haunted, a monument to ambition unchecked and voices long silenced. Evelyn walked through the deserted corridors one last time, touching the cold stone walls, feeling the presence of those who had suffered within them. Each step reminded her that history is never truly gone. It lingers in shadows, whispers, and the very fabric of the places where human lives were tested, broken, and often forgotten. Dr. Hensley remained in the central hall, kneeling amidst the remnants of the shattered brass device. His face was pale, etched with exhaustion and the dawning comprehension of what he had unleashed. He was no longer a master of the mind. He was a witness to a force far greater than science or ambition could contain. Evelyn reached out, her hand steadying his, realizing that the story of St. Elora's was not one of victory or defeat, but of revelation, a reminder that curiosity, when divorced from morality, can open doors that should remain closed. Yet amid the terror and despair, there was a glimmer of hope. Clara Weston, or what remained of her, had become a conduit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, consciousness can endure. The voices that had haunted the asylum were no longer trapped. Their suffering had been acknowledged, their existence remembered. Evelyn understood that witnessing this was a responsibility, a duty to ensure that such histories are not buried again under the guise of progress or convenience. As she stepped outside, the dawn broke over Waincroft, the pale light cutting through the mist that clung to the town. The world seemed unchanged, yet Evelyn knew differently. Beneath the streets, beneath the foundations of what seemed ordinary, the hidden layers of history persisted, waiting for those willing to see and listen. The events at St. Elora's were a fragment of a much larger tapestry, one woven from ambition, injustice, and secrets that had survived decades, sometimes centuries, in the shadows. For those who stayed to witness this story, the lesson is profound. The past is never truly gone, and the silenced voices of history demand attention. Each revelation forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, morality, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Evelyn knew that St. Elora's was only one chapter in a world full of such hidden horrors, and that the pursuit of understanding must always be tempered with respect for the lives entwined in the story. And so, as we close this chapter, know that this is not the end. There are other places, other stories, other mysteries that have been buried, forgotten, or deliberately hidden. Secrets that whisper through the corridors of time, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. In the next story, we will journey to another dark corner of history where injustice and obsession intertwine, and where the lessons of the past remain as haunting and urgent as ever. If you listened closely, if you felt the weight of what we uncovered tonight, remember that you are now part of a growing community of seekers, those who dare to confront the shadows, listen to the whispers, and uncover the truths that history tried to hide. The next mystery awaits, and the voices will be there, ready to be heard once again.